Hello, I am Pastor Jim Reynen, and I'm one of the pastors at Mount of Olives Church in Missionviejo, California. And I want to thank you for tuning in to part 2 of our 3-part series on coping with COVID. In part 1, we talked about how our children are looking to us as their parents to see how we manage our stress, our fear, and our anxieties. And based on how we handle these things, they are likely to process their feelings in the exact same way. We talked about how our children are modeling their responses to frightening situations based on how we handle them. In part 1, we discussed how we as parents, how we handle our stress is going to directly impact how our kids handle the stress, handle the fear, and the anxiety that they may be feeling at this time in their lives. Simply said, we talked about more is caught than taught. And in the words of Pastor John Stewart, we talked about how we as parents are to remain an unanxious presence in the midst of this anxious COVID time. And so in part 1, I gave you 6 tools to help you as parents process your stress, to process your fear and any anxieties that you may be feeling in a healthy way. All 6 of the tools that I gave you in the first session were methods that are found in the Bible. As a matter of fact, with each one of these 6 tools, I gave you a lot of Bible verses to support each one of them. And in part 1, I encouraged you to spend some time taking notes and to write down each of the Bible verses and then to look them up later after session 1 was finished. So here's my question, parents. How did you do? Did you do your homework? If not, you need to turn this video off right now, look up those Bible verses, read them, meditate on them, and memorize them before we continue. Of course, I'm just kidding. I want to encourage you, if you'd like to look up those Bible verses, to do so, but you're certainly welcome to do it at a later time, or you're welcome to just keep on watching with me as we move into part 2 of coping with COVID. Since in our last session, we looked at some ways for parents to manage their stress, as we look at part 2, what we're going to be doing is focusing on how parents can give their kids tools to help their kids to manage the stress or the fear, the frustrations, the depression, or just the challenges they may be feeling as a result of COVID-19. With all of the sudden disruptions in their lives, the change in routines, all the new rules, with school being canceled, very little interaction with friends, not to mention what I call the trickle-down effect, where kids are in the front row seeing how their parents, how we as their parents are handling stress, which can, through this trickle-down effect, result in some fear, result in some scary emotions and some challenges. Needless to say, many of our kids really are having a rough time processing and dealing with all the challenges related to COVID-19. So in this session, my goal really is to give you some practical tools to help your kids deal with COVID-19. Since the way a child processes stress varies so much by age, what I'm going to be doing for this session is breaking down into 3 periods of growth and human development. For each developmental stage, we'll be considering some of the challenges associated with each of these stages. And then what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at some things they can do as kids to cope with the stress, with the anxiety, with the fears and the frustrations that they may be dealing with. And then after going through these 3 specific stages of development, I'm going to then give you some general ideas to help our kids of all ages really, deal with the stress, the fear, the anxiety that may be a result of trying to cope with COVID-19. So first, we're going to begin with looking at early childhood, which basically ranges in age from about 3 years of age until 8 years old. Then we'll be looking at middle childhood, and middle childhood includes kids between the ages of approximately 9 and 11 years of age. And then finally, we'll be looking at adolescence, which starts around 12 years of age and generally goes to about the age of 18. So let's begin with the developmental stage of early childhood. Even though this stage really does include kids between the ages of 3 and 8 years old, it's important to remember that as we go through each one of these stages, age is just a guideline. Your 7 or your 8-year-old may function like a child in middle childhood rather than a child in early childhood, just like your 11 or 12-year-old might have the maturity of an adolescent. So keep in mind, as we go through these different stages, that the ages associated with each of these stages of development are just a guideline. So let's continue and look at the area of early childhood. Dr. Ellen O'Donnell is a child psychologist at Mass General, and she is also one of the co-authors of the book, Bless This Mess, A Modern Guide to Faith and Parenting in a Chaotic World. Isn't that a great title? Well, Dr. O'Donnell has identified that young children often demonstrate signs of regression from the tension that they feel in their homes during stressful times. And I would suggest this is especially true right now during this COVID outbreak. And so instead of behaving like they usually do as a typical 6-year-old, perhaps they may be demonstrating behaviors like when they were 3 or 4 years of age. They may be argumentative when it comes to food or bedtime. Or perhaps your 4-year-old might be acting like he or she did at the age of 2. You might see bedwetting. You might not have their full attention. They may be more scared and anxious than they normally are. You may see temper tantrums, or once again, they may display some sort of separation anxiety, even when you're at home in quarantine. If you go from one room to another, it may cause them to feel tension or separation anxiety. This is called regression. Of course, all kids are different, and if your kids are not exhibiting any of these signs, that's great. But if they do, don't freak out, mom or dad. These behaviors are totally understandable responses to our current situation. So keep in mind, this is only temporary, and our kids really are resilient. So how do we help kids at this stage of life if they are having negative responses to the emotional environment around them? I think the most important thing we as parents can do is, number 1, stick to a schedule. You've heard it said before, but we need to stick to a schedule or a routine as much as possible. However, keep this in mind. This routine doesn't necessarily have to mean that we need to stick to our pre-COVID schedules. In fact, it may be easier or even better to establish a new schedule with an appropriate age explanation as to why things are different right now and why we're changing things around. As you schedule daily activities, I want to encourage you to be creative and to build fun into your daily routine. Create a schedule to include daily exercise. Look for a way to include creative outlets. Maybe it's sidewalk chalk. Maybe it's other educational resources. But create a schedule. And in this schedule or this routine, I want to encourage you, not only as a parent, but also as a pastor, I want to encourage you not to forget the importance of our kids' spiritual development. Michelle Danley is the children's director here at Mount of Olives Church, and she does a phenomenal job building our children's ministry and creating what we at church call Kid City. And you can go to our church website to recognize a lot of resources that Michelle has developed, especially during this stay-at-home time of COVID-19. So I want to encourage you to go to our website, which is moochurch, M-O-O, Mount of Olives, moochurch.org. Or you can also go to Facebook and look up information related to Kid City. Check out some of the things that Michelle has put together to help your family and particularly your children to grow in their spiritual development during this difficult time. Include that as part of your daily routine. Create a COVID quarantine schedule. And the important thing, Mom and Dad, is to stick with it. Kind of a side note, I think it's important to understand that when it comes to the COVID-19 restrictions and the recommendations with social distancing and all the other expectations that are being put on our culture, we need to be aware that kids in early childhood, they may not be capable of following all of these rules. They may not understand the social distancing restrictions. So what does this mean? This means, unfortunately, that families with very young children may need to be more socially isolated than other families. It just may not be realistic to take a 4-year-old child out and have that 4-year-old remember that she cannot hug her cousins or hug a friend who may live next door. So as we talk about reopening our cities, keep in mind, just because you can go out, it doesn't necessarily mean you should. So let's move on and let's talk about the next developmental stage called middle childhood. Again, these are kids around the ages of 9 to 11 years old. As they have graduated from early childhood and are now moving into middle childhood, they are certainly more aware of their surroundings. They're more aware of what's happening in the media. They're more aware of what mom and dad are saying. They're more aware of the milieu, the environment. They're more aware of what's happening in their homes than their younger siblings or those in early childhood. They clearly understand that things are different. They see how their world is changing. They see everyone is wearing a mask. They don't see their friends. They may not understand what's going on. And so yet, in response, they may find themselves feeling stressed. They may find themselves feeling anxious and not even knowing why. Or they may be feeling a sense of fear. So let's take a moment and consider how humans respond to fear. You see, when people face fear, or when they feel fear in their lives, or when they feel threatened, or when they even feel anxiety in their lives, they often respond psychologically in 3 different ways: fight, flight, or freeze. You've probably heard the first two, the fight or flight response. But psychologists have also identified that a third response is also very typical, and that is to freeze. So when we feel fearful, a lot of times we will either want to fight, we will flight, or we will freeze. And this isn't only true of adults, but this is true of people of all ages. And as kids start to develop cognitive operations, they become more and more aware of their surroundings, and they too, even through middle childhood, demonstrate these same responses. This is also true of kids in the developmental stage of middle childhood. And so as our kids struggle with being quarantined, and as they face all of these disruptions in their schedules, as they feel anxiety, as they feel fearful, depending on the day, we may see them demonstrate all three of these responses. When they feel frustrated, we might see them demonstrate a fight response. And what does this look like? You've probably seen it among your kids where they become, or they just seem to be a little extra irritable, or they appear to be angry for no apparent reason. They're argumentative. They're on the edge. They're constantly fighting or arguing with their siblings or their parents. Maybe they're lashing out. Maybe there's tears. I think sometimes we see this fight response result in some type of overreaction. And a lot of times it's an overreaction to something as simple as a video game, where they're yelling or they're screaming or they're pounding their fists on their legs or their furniture, and they're yelling and creating these aggressive, angry emotions. They're demonstrating a lot of behavior, negative, aggressive behavior, and emotional outbursts. Maybe that's how they respond, and that response is related to fight. Or maybe their response is related to flight. This is when they flee. They run away from things. They run away from their feelings. They may be running away from their responsibilities. They may be running away from schoolwork or running away from chores or whatever it may be. Instead of facing things, instead of facing their fears, they run. They flee. There is flight. The response is flight. They run away from them. They avoid them. They avoid family. They may avoid family activities. They may avoid family talks. They run away from responsibilities. Sometimes they want to retreat. They want to retreat to their rooms or find a place where they can be alone. And so the response is flight. Or maybe thirdly, as they face the struggles that they're feeling as a result of COVID-19, maybe the response is to freeze. Maybe it's a freeze response. And a freeze response basically causes them to shut down, to feel like they are frozen. They can't talk about what's going on. They won't talk about their feelings. They won't talk about their concerns. They don't want to go anywhere. They don't want to do anything. They don't want to talk about anything. No homework, no FaceTime with friends, no nothing. Basically, this freeze response causes them to shut down. No matter what behaviors we see in our middle childhood stage of development, whether it's fight, flight, or freeze, the important thing to realize is the behaviors we're seeing really are only a symptom. The behavior really isn't a problem. When our kids are banging on their knees or yelling at their screens or demonstrating some anger, a lot of times it's not because of the video game that they're playing. A lot of times it's because there's a deep-seated fear over what's happening around them. There is anxiety deep within them. They walk in the grocery store and everybody's wearing these masks on their face. And for the kids, it creates this sort of subconscious feeling that something's not right. And so they act out. And when they act out in these ways, a lot of times the behaviors are nothing more than a symptom of what's really going on beneath the surface. So mom and dad, I know it's hard, but instead of disciplining the behavior, try asking good questions. Son, can you help me understand what you're feeling? Daughter, it appears that something's upsetting you. What's really going on? Instead of criticism, Try compassion. Instead of responding to our kids with anger and frustration, I want to encourage you to try empathy, to try and put yourself in their shoes. What might they be feeling and why? Think about what it must be like to be an elementary school age, whose life has been turned upside down, who can't enjoy all the normal kid activities. Try to put yourself in their shoes. Licensed children's therapist Dr. Katie Lear says this: during this time of COVID-19, children may be fearful not only for their own health and safety, but also for the health and safety of their family members as well. And so when I think about a quote like that, it reminds me that we need to be aware of how our children may be processing COVID-19. And so as they become aware of these health issues and the risk populations, they may start conversations or express concern over their grandparents. Mom, is grandma going to die? Dad, are grandpa and grandma going to be okay? Or perhaps they may even transfer some of these feelings to questions about their own safety related to death. Mom, am I going to die? Dad, am I going to die? The more our kids become aware through middle childhood of their surroundings, the more likely these questions will come up. With all that they're hearing, with all they're seeing, with everything that our kids are feeling, this is a natural response. And these really are natural concerns. So what we as parents need to do is, in an age-appropriate manner, we need to acknowledge that, yeah, there are certain people who are more at risk. But we need to be sure to tell them that most of the people who contract COVID-19 are going to be completely fine. And of course, we need to reassure them that they are safe and that we as their parents are doing everything we can to protect them, to love them, to ensure their safety. And really, there isn't that much that our kids really need to worry about. And so during these middle childhood years, as our kids are developing the ability to consider life and to think about things from other people's perspectives and feelings, like I talked about in session 1, it's super important for you and me as parents to model healthy responses to fear. As our kids are developing the ability to see things the way we see things, we need to be careful, because how we handle our stress, the way we model these things to our kids, is going to really instruct them how to manage their stress. It's going to inform them how to handle the anxiety and fear that they may be feeling. And so if we're stressed, they will be stressed. If we're calm, they will be calm. So we need to keep a handle on our behaviors. More is caught than taught. Remember, they're watching. And so the bottom line is, at this age of middle childhood, children need age-appropriate information about the coronavirus. They need to engage in discussion. We need to engage with them in discussions about how to handle this, how it spreads, and what we need to do to protect ourselves and to remain safe. You can open up a conversation about this pandemic with your child by asking them what have they heard? What have they heard about the coronavirus? And when you do, you may be surprised. You may be surprised how much information they really have. Or you may be surprised at how the rumors have spread and some of the silly things or some of the incorrect information that they may have even related to stay at home or social distancing. Even that the things we do, like social distancing, even though the things like wearing a mask or washing our hands, it's when we think about these things, it's important to encourage our kids that we do these things not only to protect ourselves, but we also do it to protect others. And when we begin the conversation about not only do we do these things to protect ourselves, but we do these things to protect others, what that also does is it not only models empathy, but it helps to teach kids to see things from another's perspective. As far as how we as parents can help our kids in this age bracket, my suggestion is first, we need to spend as much time with our kids as possible. Not just being in the same room with them, not just sitting there looking at Facebook or doing work on our laptop, but we need to be present. Physically, emotionally, be present with your kids. Engage them in activities. Get down on the floor with them. Play Legos, board games. Play with their dolls. Read their stories. Read stories with them together. Tell stories together. Engage with your kids. Spend time with them. The next thing I want to encourage you to do is to talk to them. Assure them they are safe. Assure them they will be okay. And ask good questions. Ask them what they are thinking about. But most importantly, I think it's super important for us to listen, to practice active listening. In other words, when we're having a conversation with our kids, active listening is more than just nodding your head, yeah, while we're watching TV, yeah, whatever. No, active listening is more than just a cue of a head nod, but rather repeating back to them what our kids are saying. And it often sounds like this: what I hear you saying is, and then we go back and repeat the very things that they have said. You see, when we do that, we are acknowledging not only that we've heard what they've said, but it also reassures them that we are listening. And by the way, this is not just a great practice with your children, but also with your husband or your wife, or anybody for that matter. Sometimes it's important for us to give one another a chance to express ourselves. It's important for our kids to be able to get the junk out, to be heard. Being heard sometimes can make all the difference. So let's move on. Let's move on to adolescence. As I mentioned, my wife and I, Jennifer, have 2 kids. Our daughter, Grace, is going to be a senior in high school this year, and our son, Noah, is going to be a freshman in high school this year. So adolescence is certainly an age group that's near and dear to my heart as a parent. For more than 20 years, while being a minister, I also worked with student ministries as a youth pastor. My studies in college were geared a lot toward adolescent psychology. And so this is a topic that really is near and dear to my heart. And so as we think about adolescence, I'm not talking about an immature adult. I mean, you may be married to a 40-year-old adolescent, but that's not what I'm talking about here. By adolescent, we're talking about kids. Kids who may look like adults, kids who may think they're adults, kids who may be in that transitional time between being a child and an adult. But technically what we're looking at are those kids who are between the ages of between the ages of 12 and 18 years of age. And in my experience as a parent, as a pastor, this is the age group who is probably feeling the most anxiety the most dramatic, having probably the greatest struggle related to COVID-19. You see, adolescence is already a very stressful time for most kids, but now with distance learning, they've had to navigate large amounts of homework with very little guidance from their teachers. And that's not a slam on our teachers. Our teachers are awesome and they're doing a great job. But even kids who are generally motivated to do well in school often lack the executive functioning abilities needed to self-direct and to schedule their own study time. The result of this has been avoidance. They have avoided doing their schoolwork. They have avoided doing their studies, their homework. Their grades are dropping. And because of the frustrations related to this online distant learning and the frustrations, there's probably been a lot more arguments with siblings and fights with parents. Maybe that's been your experience. Our high school age children are also dealing with a lot of the losses of just their general high school experiences. Things like graduation, things like the prom, visiting colleges as they anticipate going to college in the next year or two. They're missing out on their theater productions, their music concerts, their choir concerts, and of course, what about sports? A lot of our students, a lot of our kids, for many, many, many years have been training, have been participating on teams, and to have their sports yanked out from under them their junior year, their senior year, has really created a lot of frustration and anger. Not to mention, with so much pressure to get into a good college, we see with our 10th and 11th graders how much they're freaking out over grades, wondering, do I still need to take the SAT or don't I? Will it be offered again? Will colleges excuse the SAT or will they be requiring it? But as I think about adolescence, it's not just the frustrations associated with online distance learning. It's not just the loss of the typical high school experiences like missing prom and graduation, even though these are super frustrating and huge losses for our kids. I'm not trying to discount them. But I think what's upsetting our kids the most, I think what's having the most negative impact on our kids is really being socially cut off from their peers. You see, we all need social interaction, but I think this is especially true of adolescents. Because if you think about what adolescents are striving for, which is independence and autonomy, which is the appropriate outcome of adolescence, teenagers are in this stage of life where they're supposed to be pulling away from their parents. That's a healthy part of adolescence. They're supposed to be disengaging in some ways from their parents and really engaging more and more with their peers as they're becoming autonomous, independent individuals. But because of COVID-19, they now find themselves feeling trapped, feeling stuck at home with the very people they're supposed to be gaining independence from. And that's not a bad thing, parents. Isn't that our goal? To develop fully functioning, healthy adults? But instead of connecting with their peers, they're cut off from them. This is super important because teenagers hold friendships at a much higher regard than even we do as their parents. Many teenagers feel closer to their friends than they do with their families. It's important to note that for these teenagers, their friendships not only provide entertainment and a sense of social interaction, but more importantly, these friendships provide them with some serious emotional support. And mom and dad, it's not that we are not there for our kids, but a lot of times our kids choose to lean on their friends for the support they need emotionally. They're going through life together. Their friends relate at a different level than we as their parents do. And they depend on those friendships for emotional support. Let's face it, mom and dad, I think we've all had the experience. When something goes wrong in our son or our daughter's lives, who do they turn to first? Maybe they still come to you. My kids still come to me on occasion. But I think their first response is to contact their BFF, to reach out to their friends. So as we think of all of these issues that are manifesting themselves in their lives, we begin to see our kids demonstrate a lack of energy. There is a lack of motivation and even a loss of interest in the things that they previously enjoyed. We are seeing, even like we did with our younger kids in middle childhood, we're seeing increased irritability. We're seeing outbursts for no apparent reason. Crying, tears. There's more arguing with siblings, fighting with parents. We're also seeing the same avoidance behaviors. How many of your teenagers are staying up all night and sleeping all day? Binging on Netflix all night? They're glued to their screens. They're not willing to engage in family activities. They're engaging in avoidance behaviors. So how do we help our adolescent kids cope with COVID-19? The first thing we need to do is realize, even though our kids may be reluctant to vocalize their worries and their fears, it doesn't mean that they're not feeling them. So just like we need to model as parents how we handle stress, we also need to model how we can express our feelings, how we can express our thoughts, our concerns, our anxieties, and our fears. As parents, it's important for us to model this and to talk about these things with our kids. With our older kids, it's important that we be transparent and talk about how we are feeling. I'm not talking about venting to them, dumping all our frustrations on them, or giving them too much negative information, or having them carry the weight of our emotional problems. What I'm talking about is having a mature, age-appropriate, healthy conversation with our kids about how we are feeling as a way to model how we can express our feelings. When we model what it looks like to talk about our feelings in a healthy way, our kids are much more likely to do the same. It's also important for us to encourage them to stay connected with their friends. For some kids, this isn't a problem. They're already on social media, they're FaceTiming, they're connecting, they're sneaking out of the house, they're meeting their friends at the end of the street, they're going to the park. For some of our friends, for some of our kids, this really isn't a problem for them to see our friends. But for the kids who may be a bit more withdrawn, for our kids who may look like they've given up, or they're just disconnected or uninterested in connecting with their friends, this is super important. You need to really encourage them, even push them to call a friend, to FaceTime with somebody, to have a Zoom interaction with a group of friends, to connect with one another through Instagram. And if you feel comfortable, as some of the social restrictions are being lifted in our communities, I want to even encourage you as parents to invite the friends of our kids to come over, to hang out in our backyards. Encourage your kids to meet up with their friends at a park. You see, as we think about helping our adolescent-aged kids, It's important for them to connect. But I think another area that I want to address related to adolescence has to do with helping our kids establish realistic goals. Many of our kids are very goal driven. And prior to the quarantine, they had a ton of goals. And because they've withdrawn or they've started to avoid, because they've felt frustrated or defeated, a lot of these goals have been ignored or forgotten or neglected. And so I want to encourage you to help them to establish goals, but not just goals, but realistic goals. You see, the things they did before COVID-19 may not be possible during the quarantine. Unfortunately, the goals they may have had before all of this stuff happened may need to be put on hold. So help them to establish new goals. Help them to develop new routines. So as we think about re-establishing goals or creating COVID-friendly goals, let's take school for an example. I believe it's important to acknowledge that the time they spend in school is important, but I think it's more important that we emphasize the end result. The goal may be process versus outcome. We may focus on process instead of outcome. For example, a child who focuses and puts in a good effort for 2 hours each day should be praised, regardless of whether they finish one assignment or 2 assignments, 3 assignments, or 4. Regardless of what grade they get, in our culture, where there is so much pressure to succeed, this may be difficult, but instead of focusing on the grade or instead of focusing on the outcome, perhaps if we focus on the process, we could reduce the stress and anxiety they feel over schoolwork or grades, but to praise them, to acknowledge them for putting in the effort, for doing a good job, for sitting at the computer for a couple hours, to focus on the process and not necessarily the outcome. Even though our kids may have become accustomed to staying up all night and sleeping all day for these last few weeks, I want to also encourage you to encourage good sleep hygiene, to help them maintain some semblance of their normal school day routine. This may seem kind of strange, especially with summer vacation just around the corner, but I think it's important, whatever our kids are going through, to help them to develop a routine, to help them develop structure, because I think sometimes the chaos results in confusion. The confusion can lead to frustration. Whatever your kids are going through, it's so important that we also spend time validating them, that we validate what they're going through, to validate how hard this time is for all of us. To say something like, it's really not fair that this is happening. I can't imagine how hard this must be for you. I'm so sorry you missed out on your prom. I'm so sorry you worked so hard and couldn't graduate with your peers and go through the graduation celebrations. Whatever it may be, I want to encourage you to validate your kids, because sometimes just hearing this validation from a parent can really help calm the frustration. As parents, we need to empathize with our kids. We need to try and see things from their perspective. You see, the bottom line with adolescents, and really with kids of all age, comes down to this, that we as parents, that we need to help our teens, our kids of all ages, recognize that they still have a future. No matter what the fall may look like, whether they return to school, whether they're online classes, whether they're discouraged about their current situation or not. We need to help them realize that they still have a future and that this difficult time will not last forever. So to recap and to give you a couple general tools. Number one, help your kids stay connected with others. This may be FaceTime. This may be calling them, calling friends, calling relatives. Help them stay connected with others by playing games. Depending on the age group, age-appropriate games. Maybe it means doing puzzles, connecting as a family, talking to one another. Number two, keep up their physical activity. This is so important. Instead of laying on the couch and binging Netflix hour after hour after hour, take advantage of the nicer weather. Go outside. As the restrictions are being lifted, go down to the beach. Take a walk in the sand. Feel the sand between your toes. Walk up and down that boardwalk. Go for a walk. Go for a jog. Take the dogs for a walk. Go for a hike. Enjoy the outdoors. Or find an exercise program online. Connect with a personal trainer or a gym. I work out with my trainer through Zoom. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9 a.m. I do a boxing class with Gary Boom Boom Ballard on Zoom. You can find him on Facebook. He's a great trainer. Highly recommend him. Kids of all ages are welcome. And you too, Mom and Dad. That was for you, Gary. All right, number three, monitor their news and social media intake. Talk to your children about how to select news with factual information. There's so much hype out there. There's so much controversial news and so many biased reports, so much politically driven information out there. Help them to sort through the hype and to look at the valid sources and to help them select news that is factual. Not only do we monitor their news, but as I said, we also need to limit their social media intake, limit the amount of time they spend on media. Certainly it's important that they stay connected with their friends through their phones and their Instagram and their social media accounts. But what I'm talking about are the mindless activity of YouTube. I'm talking about the Netflix, sitting around binge watching Tiger King with Joe Exotic and Carol Baskins, watching all those TV shows that are just mind-numbing. Sometimes that's a nice escape, but it's also important to engage. It's also important to be productive and to produce. And so we need to really think about monitoring the news and limiting the social media intake. Number four, as we've talked about, keep up a routine. Create a schedule and stick to it. This means go to bed on time and try to go to bed at the same time. And right along with that is wake up at the same time. This may mean setting an alarm. Yes, even with no school, it's important to set an alarm and get up on time. And instead of hanging out all day in your pajamas, sitting around with bedhead all day, I want to encourage you to, as part of that routine, not only wake up, but get up and get dressed. Take a shower, start the day, get ready, eat breakfast, start your schoolwork, have a scheduled time of studies, schedule your schoolwork, designate a time for recess, designate a time to go out and play in the backyard, to go for recess, to have physical activity, to work out, to take a walk. Create a schedule and stick to it. Be consistent. Number five, just a few more. Number five, we need to help our kids to get out of their heads. Too often we live up here. We get stuck up here and we overthink. And so it's important to take the focus out of ourselves and the focus on others. And this is why we as parents need to model and teach empathy to help our kids to be able to experience things, to feel things, to understand what other people are going through, and to realize it's not just about them. I think it's important for us to look for ways to connect with others, but when we think about how we can get out of our heads, sometimes the way we do that is by putting others before ourselves. And one of the ways we can help our kids to get out of their heads is to look for ways to serve. Maybe you've got a neighbor who your kids can go help them with some activities around their house. Maybe if you don't want your kids to leave your house, maybe you can do an art project, have arts and craft time where maybe you're creating cards or you're writing cards for elderly members of your community, of your church, people you know who might be shut in or isolated, especially during this quarantine. Number 6, I want to encourage you as parents to help your kids to remain calm, to provide reassurances to them. And the way we do this really as parents is it begins by how we behave. And we need to model an appropriate response to stress. We need to talk to our kids about what they're feeling, what they're going through, to help them reframe their concerns, to make sure our explanations to them are age appropriate, to ask good questions, to practice active listening, to listen to them, to let them know that you are there for them. And number 7, we need to keep things positive. Number 7, keep things positive. You see, I think sometimes when we feel stressed or overwhelmed, by talking about the things that we are grateful for, by spending time as a family, talking about how much we appreciate one another. You know, in the Bible, there's a pattern. When the Apostle Paul writes some of the books in the New Testament, he often says, I thank God for you because, and then he goes on to tell them the very reasons he's thankful for them. Can you think of a more positive thing to do as a family? Even tonight, to sit around the dinner table, to go around the table and say, I thank God for you because, and then tell your kids the very things about them that you are thankful. I think it's important to talk about not only the things we are grateful for, but to talk about the things that are going well. Certainly there are a lot of frustrations related to COVID-19, to the quarantine, having to stay at home, seeing all of the businesses that are struggling. But I think we can also identify some wonderful things that have come out of COVID-19. And so I want to encourage you to find those things and to focus on the positive things that have come out of being quarantined. I think it's important for us to help our kids choose healthy activities, to look for ways to engage, to be physical. I think it's important also to talk about being flexible as a family, as we cope with each other and with the challenges each day brings. Hopefully the stay-at-home orders will be lifted soon. It sort of seems to be what's been going on in the media, at least from what I've read and seen. And all the stress that we've had to associate with being locked down and having to stay at home as a result of the quarantine may be reduced. And so I want to suggest to you this, that all the information that I've given to you in session 1 and here in session 2 in terms of how we as parents can manage our stress, and some of the things I've identified in terms of how our teenage kids can process their stress in a healthy way as well, that all of these things are not just related to COVID-19 and the current quarantine situation, but rather everything that I've been sharing with you is information that relates to how we handle stress in general. And so in the future, when we get through this pandemic, through this COVID crisis, which we will, when we get through this, everything that I've shared with you can relate to any stressor that might come your way. And so I want to encourage you, once we have the stay-at-home orders lifted, once we can return to restaurants and churches and our everyday life, as we perhaps even experienced before COVID-19, I want to encourage you to take note of some of the things I've talked about and to apply them in your lives as you experience stress, frustrations, and anxiety over other circumstances that may come your way. I want to thank you for tuning in to the first 2 sessions of this 3-part series on COVID-19. And finally, I want to also encourage you in my final session, which is session 3, to tune in, because that's going to be a different format. I'm not going to be talking at you for 45 minutes to an hour. Instead, I'm going to have a dialogue with a good friend of mine by the name of Joe Jardine. Joe Jardine is a psychology professor at the university. He is also a well-known licensed and marriage family therapist in the area. Joe is also a recognized life coach, as well as a performance coach for sports teams. He works with professional athletes, collegiate athletes, and various teams throughout the United States. And so I want to encourage you to join us for session number 3. Joe has a wealth of knowledge, and he's going to help us not only think about how families can continue to cope with stress and frustration, but he's also going to be addressing how we as parents can help our kids who might be struggling with separation anxiety. Our kids have become very accustomed to having mommy and daddy home with them throughout these last few months. As mom and dad have been there with them every single day, they have grown attached to having mom and dad with us. But as our kids return to daycare, or as they return to preschool or elementary school, there may be some separation anxiety. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty much willing to guarantee there will be separation anxiety. So tune in and allow Joe to speak into the situation and help our kids process the separation anxiety they may be feeling. So thank you again for tuning in. May God bless you and bless your families. Until next time, take care.